The world rarely takes from you by force. More often it takes from you because you never learned when to close the door. The more accessible you become, the more your presence shifts from appreciated to expected. A strange rule governs human nature. What is constantly available gradually loses its perceived value. Not because people are cruel, but because familiarity quietly turns gratitude into assumption. Time, attention, energy. These are the most valuable things a person possesses, yet they are often given away as though they cost nothing. The Stoics understood something that modern life encourages us to forget. Your peace has value. Your attention has value. Your presence has value. The moment you allow unlimited access to them, you begin teaching the world that they are free. And what costs nothing is rarely protected and rarely valued. This is why so many people feel exhausted despite doing everything they were told would earn appreciation. They confuse being available with being valuable. They confuse constant accessibility with genuine importance. The truth is more uncomfortable than that. Many of the people who feel overlooked are not lacking worth. They are giving it away too freely. They answer every request. They carry burdens that were never theirs to carry. They make themselves available to everyone except themselves. Then they wonder why they feel drained, invisible, and disconnected from their own lives. The problem is not that they have too little value. The problem is that they have forgotten the cost of their own presence. Most people never question the idea that being available is a sign of goodness. It is presented as a virtue from an early age. Answer quickly. Help when asked. Be dependable. Be accommodating. Be there whenever someone needs you. On the surface, these qualities seem admirable, and in the right measure, they are. The problem begins when availability stops being a choice and becomes a condition of existence. Somewhere along the way, many people stop choosing where their time goes and start surrendering it automatically. They become so accustomed to responding to every request that they no longer stop to consider whether the request deserves a response at all. Accessibility becomes the default, and what begins as kindness slowly transforms into something else entirely. Human beings adapt remarkably well. That ability allows us to survive hardship, recover from setbacks, and continue moving forward when circumstances become difficult. Yet the same tendency creates an unexpected problem in relationships. The things that are consistently present often become invisible. Not because they lose importance, but because the mind becomes accustomed to them. Consider the steady ticking of a clock on a wall. At first you notice it. Then it fades into the background. The sound hasn't changed, only your attention has. Something similar happens when a person makes themselves endlessly available. Their presence becomes expected rather than appreciated. Their reliability becomes assumed rather than acknowledged. This can be difficult to accept because it seems to contradict everything people are taught about relationships. Many assume that giving more automatically creates greater value, yet value is rarely determined by effort alone. It is shaped by perception, attention, and scarcity. When something is always available, the mind gradually stops assigning conscious importance to it. This is not necessarily an act of disrespect. It is simply how human psychology works. As Seneca observed, nothing is prized more highly than what is difficult to attain. People notice change more than consistency, absence more than presence, interruption more than routine. A person who is always there eventually becomes part of the scenery in other people's lives. The consequences of this pattern are often subtle at first. A message arrives and receives an immediate reply. A favor is requested and accepted without hesitation. A problem appears and someone rushes in to solve it. Each moment seems insignificant on its own, yet over time they create an unspoken expectation. Access becomes assumed rather than appreciated. The person giving their energy starts carrying more responsibility while receiving less consideration. Their role becomes fixed. They become the one who understands, the one who listens, the one who adjusts. And because this role develops gradually, they rarely notice how much of themselves they have invested until exhaustion begins to appear. Exhaustion is often misunderstood. Many assume it comes from working too hard or carrying too many obligations. Sometimes it comes from something deeper. It emerges when a person gives attention to everything except their own inner life. They become experts at managing the needs of others while neglecting their own priorities. They know everyone else's problems, schedules, concerns, and emotions, yet remain disconnected from themselves. Their days become crowded with obligations that seemed small when accepted, but become heavy when accumulated. Exhaustion rarely comes from one great sacrifice. More often, it comes from hundreds of small concessions made without thought. The Stoics understood something that remains relevant centuries later. Time is not simply a resource. It is the substance of life itself. Every hour given away is a portion of existence that can never be reclaimed. Money can return. Opportunities can return. Possessions can be replaced. Time moves in only one direction. This awareness led Stoic thinkers to guard their attention carefully, not because they were selfish, but because they understood that a life spent reacting to everything leaves little room for intentional living. The person who owns their attention owns their direction. The person who gives it away indiscriminately gradually loses both. This does not mean withdrawing from the world or refusing to help others. It means recognizing the difference between conscious generosity and unconscious self-neglect. One comes from strength, the other from fear. Fear of disappointing someone, fear of appearing selfish, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing approval. These fears quietly influence decisions that seem harmless in the moment. A person says yes because saying no feels uncomfortable. They remain available because setting limits feels difficult. They continue giving because stopping feels unfamiliar. Yet every decision carries a cost, even when that cost remains invisible. Over time, a strange paradox begins to emerge. The more a person sacrifices their own priorities to accommodate everyone else, the less connected they feel to their own life. Their schedule becomes full, but their sense of purpose becomes weaker. Their conversations increase, but their inner clarity decreases. Their accessibility grows, but their presence loses weight. The very thing they hoped would create appreciation often produces the opposite effect. Not because people are intentionally taking advantage of them, but because unlimited access naturally reduces perceived value. There is a quiet lesson hidden inside this realization. Presence gains meaning when it is intentional. Attention gains value when it is directed. Time gains significance when it is protected. The goal is not to become distant or unavailable. The goal is to become deliberate. To recognize that attention is one of the most powerful forms of currency a person possesses. Every conversation, commitment, and obligation represents an investment of that currency. And like any investment, it deserves consideration. Once this becomes clear, a different question begins to emerge. Not how much can be given, but where it should be given. Not how available one can become, but what deserves access in the first place. Because the value of presence is never determined by how often it is offered. It is determined by the awareness behind its offering. And when attention is distributed with intention rather than habit, something remarkable begins to happen. Energy returns, clarity returns, a sense of ownership returns. What was once scattered gradually becomes focused. What was once expected becomes meaningful. And what was once taken for granted begins to carry weight again. If these ideas speak to something deeper within you, consider subscribing. Not as a gesture of support, but as a commitment to returning to these principles. In a world that constantly competes for your attention, choosing reflection over distraction is a rare decision. And sometimes, a single idea revisited at the right moment can change the direction of an entire life. The value of something often becomes visible only when it is no longer guaranteed. This is one of the quiet truths that governs human behavior. People lock away what is rare. They protect what can disappear. They pay attention to what is limited. Yet when it comes to their own presence, many act as though these principles no longer apply. They make themselves endlessly available, endlessly accommodating, endlessly predictable. Every message receives an immediate response. Every request receives consideration. Every invitation receives attention. Their presence becomes so reliable that it loses the quality that once made it meaningful. Not because they have become less valuable, but because constant availability removes the possibility of absence. This is not a cynical observation about human nature. It is simply a recognition of how attention works. The mind is drawn to contrast. It notices beginnings and endings, change and interruption. What remains constant often fades into the background, even when it remains important. As Aristotle observed, we value what is rare more than what is abundant. The air in a room is essential, yet few people think about it until it becomes difficult to breathe. The same pattern appears in relationships, workplaces, and everyday interactions. A person who is always available can become so familiar that their presence is assumed rather than valued. Their reliability becomes an expectation rather than a gift. Over time, that expectation becomes invisible. The Stoics understood the importance of remembering that nothing is permanent. They reflected regularly on loss, not because they were pessimistic, but because they knew awareness sharpens appreciation. When people remember that something can disappear, they see it differently. They stop treating it casually. They stop assuming it will always be there. They become more attentive, more grateful, more conscious. Yet many people unknowingly create the opposite effect in their own lives. They remove all uncertainty from their availability. Others never have to wonder whether they will answer, whether they will show up, or whether they will make time. The answer is always predictable. Eventually, predictability turns into assumption. There is a subtle cost hidden inside this pattern. It rarely announces itself dramatically. Instead, it appears through small moments that seem harmless on their own. Agreeing to another commitment despite feeling exhausted, rearranging plans to satisfy someone else's expectations, accepting responsibilities that were never yours to carry. Each decision feels minor. Each accommodation seems reasonable, yet these moments accumulate. They form habits. Those habits become identities. Before long, a person becomes known more for their accessibility than for their values, goals, or aspirations. They become the one who is always there, even when being there comes at the expense of their own well-being. What makes this particularly difficult to recognize is that it often feels virtuous. Society frequently rewards availability. People are praised for being helpful, dependable, and selfless. These qualities have value, but they can become distorted when disconnected from discernment. There is a difference between generosity and automatic compliance. One comes from intention. The other often comes from fear. Fear of disappointing someone, fear of appearing selfish, fear of creating discomfort. These fears operate quietly beneath the surface, influencing choices that seem insignificant in the moment but become significant over time. Many people spend years living according to expectations they never consciously chose. They attend gatherings they do not enjoy. They participate in conversations that leave them drained. They commit to obligations that pull them away from what truly matters. They become so busy responding to external demands that they lose sight of internal priorities. Then a strange feeling begins to emerge. Their days are full, yet they feel disconnected. Their schedules are crowded, yet their progress slows. Their attention is constantly occupied, yet their deeper goals remain untouched. This confusion is often mistaken for a lack of motivation, when in reality it is a lack of alignment. Every commitment carries an unseen consequence. time invested in one direction cannot be invested elsewhere. Attention given to one thing is attention unavailable for another. This reality is simple, yet it is easy to ignore. Every unnecessary yes contains a hidden no. A no to rest, a no to growth, a no to reflection, a no to work that matters. These hidden costs rarely appear immediately. They reveal themselves gradually, often after months or years of accumulated neglect. By then, many people find themselves wondering why they feel stuck despite being constantly occupied. The answer is often found in the gap between activity and intention. Activity creates the appearance of productivity. Intention creates actual progress. A person can spend an entire day responding to requests and still move no closer to the life they want. They can satisfy countless expectations while abandoning their own. The danger is not that others ask for too much. People will always have needs, opinions, and requests. The greater danger is forgetting that access to your time is not an entitlement. It is a privilege. When this distinction becomes blurred, priorities begin to collapse under the weight of endless obligations. This realization changes the way a person views responsibility. It becomes clear that protecting time is not selfish, protecting energy is not selfish, protecting attention is not selfish. These actions are necessary because they preserve the resources required to live deliberately. As Epictetus reminded his students, no man is free who is not master of himself. A person who never protects their attention eventually loses control over where it goes. Their focus becomes fragmented, their decisions become reactive, their days become shaped by urgency rather than purpose. And when urgency takes control, deeper ambitions slowly fade into the distance. The challenge, then, is not learning how to give more. Most people already know how to do that. The challenge is learning when to pause, learning when to decline, learning when to allow space between a request and a response. That space is where intention lives. It is where clarity emerges. It is where a person begins distinguishing between what merely demands attention and what genuinely deserves it. Once this perspective takes hold, the relationship with availability begins to change. Presence becomes more deliberate. Commitments become more meaningful. Time becomes something to invest rather than something to spend carelessly. And as this shift occurs, another truth gradually reveals itself. The question is not whether people will take what is offered. Human nature makes that almost inevitable. The more important question is why so many continue offering everything without first considering the cost. That answer reaches far deeper than schedules, obligations, or social expectations. It reaches into the way people define their own worth, and that is where the next layer of understanding begins to unfold. There is another layer to this conversation that often goes unnoticed because it hides behind qualities that appear positive on the surface. Many people believe they simply enjoy helping others. They believe they are naturally supportive, generous, and dependable. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the need to be helpful is driven by something much deeper. Being needed can feel powerful. It can create a sense of importance that is difficult to find elsewhere. When someone depends on you, calls you first, seeks your advice, or turns to you during difficult moments, it creates the impression that you matter. It creates a feeling of significance. And because that feeling is so rewarding, many people begin chasing it without realizing they are doing so. The Stoics understood that true stability cannot be built upon things that exist outside your control. Reputation can change, approval can disappear, circumstances can shift without warning. If self-worth depends entirely on these external factors, peace becomes fragile. A person becomes vulnerable to every opinion, every rejection, and every change in social dynamics. Their emotional state begins rising and falling according to forces they cannot fully control. That is not freedom. It is a different form of captivity, one that often feels comfortable because it is familiar. Many people spend years negotiating for validation without realizing it. They become experts at reading the room, experts at anticipating expectations, experts at adjusting themselves to fit what others want. They seek signs of acceptance everywhere. A compliment lifts their mood. Criticism ruins their day. Inclusion feels like proof of worth. Exclusion feels like evidence of failure. Gradually, they begin outsourcing their identity to the people around them. Instead of deciding who they are, they wait for others to tell them. This creates a dangerous imbalance. The more a person relies on external approval, the more power they hand to external sources. Their behavior becomes shaped by the desire to maintain acceptance. They avoid difficult conversations. They tolerate poor treatment. They remain silent when they should speak. They agree when they should disagree. The goal shifts from living according to principles to maintaining approval, and once approval becomes the priority, authenticity begins to disappear. What makes this especially painful is that the strategy rarely produces the result people hope for. Many assume that constantly seeking acceptance will make them more respected. In reality, it often creates the opposite effect. Desperation has a way of revealing itself, even when someone tries to hide it. Others sense when a person is afraid to lose them. They sense when someone needs validation more than they need honesty. This changes the dynamic in subtle ways. The person seeking approval begins adapting. The other person begins leading. One becomes increasingly dependent, while the other becomes increasingly influential. A person who cannot tolerate rejection eventually becomes willing to accept situations that violate their standards. They stay longer than they should. They excuse behavior that should concern them. They compromise values they once considered non-negotiable. Their fear of losing connection becomes greater than their commitment to self-respect. Little by little, they trade dignity for acceptance. At first, the compromises seem small. Then, they become habits. Eventually, they become a way of life. Something similar happens with solitude. Many people fear being alone not because solitude is painful, but because it removes distractions. It creates silence. And in that silence, they must confront themselves. Without constant interaction, there is no audience to impress, no approval to pursue, no validation to collect. There is only the relationship they have with their own mind. For some, this feels uncomfortable because they have spent so long defining themselves through others that they no longer know who they are without external feedback. Yet solitude contains an important lesson. It teaches a person that they can survive their own company. It reveals that peace does not require constant affirmation. It shows that worth is not created by attention. Once this lesson is learned, relationships begin to change. The neediness that once shaped interactions starts to dissolve. Conversations become more honest. Boundaries become easier to maintain. Decisions become less reactive. There is less pressure to earn acceptance because acceptance is no longer the primary goal. This shift creates a remarkable form of freedom. People often assume freedom means having more options, more opportunities, or more influence. In reality, freedom frequently begins with independence from unnecessary approval. As Epictetus observed, if you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. The moment a person stops chasing validation, they stop treating every interaction like a test they must pass. They stop performing. They stop negotiating their identity. They stop asking others to confirm what they should already know. And something unexpected happens in that space. Relationships become clearer. The people who genuinely belong remain. The people who were attracted only to compliance often drift away. What remains is built on choice rather than dependency. There is no need to convince, chase, or prove. There is only the quiet confidence that comes from standing firmly in one's own values. From that position, connection becomes healthier because it is no longer driven by fear. It is driven by intention. And when intention replaces desperation, a person stops begging to be chosen and begins choosing for themselves. Once a person stops chasing approval, another change begins to unfold almost naturally. It is quieter than the first transformation, but often far more powerful. The need to constantly justify every decision starts to fade. Many people do not realize how much energy they spend explaining themselves until they stop doing it. They explain why they declined an invitation. They explain why they changed direction. They explain why they need time alone. They explain their goals, their priorities, their boundaries, and even their preferences. Every decision is accompanied by a defense, as though simply choosing a path is not enough. It is as if permission must be obtained before action can be taken. Yet beneath all these explanations lies a deeper concern. The fear that someone might disagree, the fear that someone might not understand. This fear influences behavior more than most people realize. It encourages over-communication where clarity would have been sufficient. It turns simple decisions into lengthy justifications. A person says no, then spends 10 minutes explaining why. They choose a different path, then feel obligated to convince others that the choice makes sense. They establish a boundary, then immediately begin defending it. The pattern becomes so common that it feels normal. Yet when examined closely, something interesting appears. The explanation is rarely for the benefit of the listener. More often, it is an attempt to reduce personal discomfort. It is a way of seeking reassurance that the decision will be accepted. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his life surrounded by criticism, expectations, and conflicting opinions. Yet his writings rarely suggest that peace comes from changing how others perceive you. Again and again, the focus returns inward. Govern your own mind. Fulfill your responsibilities. Live according to your principles. The opinions of others may exist, but they do not have authority over your character unless you grant it. This perspective creates a profound shift in how decisions are approached. Instead of asking whether everyone will understand, the question becomes whether the action aligns with what is right and necessary. Many people struggle with this because they confuse understanding with agreement. They want others to understand their choices, but what they are often seeking is approval. Understanding cannot always be guaranteed. People interpret actions through the lens of their own experiences, preferences, and expectations. Two individuals can witness the same decision and arrive at completely different conclusions. One may respect it, another may criticize it. Trying to control those interpretations becomes an endless task, because the outcome remains outside your control. The Stoics recognized that energy invested in controlling uncontrollable things is energy wasted. This realization changes the relationship with misunderstanding. Most people treat misunderstanding as a threat. They fear being judged unfairly. They fear being perceived incorrectly. They fear becoming the subject of assumptions they cannot correct. Yet being misunderstood is often less damaging than abandoning your own convictions in an effort to avoid criticism. A person who constantly adjusts their behavior to satisfy every expectation eventually loses sight of what they actually believe. They become skilled at managing perceptions, but disconnected from themselves. The cost of that trade is rarely worth paying. There is a certain strength that emerges when a person becomes comfortable allowing others to hold incomplete information. Not every decision requires a detailed explanation. Not every choice requires public approval. Not every boundary requires a debate. Sometimes a simple response is enough. Sometimes silence is enough. This can feel uncomfortable at first, because many people have spent years believing that they owe explanations to everyone around them. The habit runs deep. Yet, as the habit weakens, a surprising sense of freedom begins to appear. Part of that freedom comes from recognizing how often explanations invite unnecessary negotiation. The moment a person offers a long justification, they often create an opportunity for others to challenge it. The conversation shifts away from the decision itself and toward defending the reasoning behind it. Soon the focus is no longer on personal values, but on persuading someone else. A boundary becomes a discussion, a decision becomes a debate, a preference becomes something that must be validated. This process quietly transfers authority away from the individual and places it into the hands of external opinion. Perhaps this is why some of the strongest individuals are often quieter than expected. Their silence is not insecurity. It is not withdrawal. It is not a lack of knowledge. It is discipline. They understand that words carry weight when they are used carefully. They understand that not every opinion deserves a response, and not every misunderstanding requires correction. Their attention remains focused on what matters, rather than becoming entangled in every external reaction. Over time, this approach creates a different relationship with influence. Influence no longer comes from convincing everyone. It comes from consistency, from alignment between words and actions, from the quiet certainty that emerges when a person no longer feels obligated to explain every step they take. And once that certainty develops, silence stops feeling empty. It begins to feel powerful, because within that silence lies something most people spend their entire lives searching for, but rarely find: the confidence to trust their own judgment without needing constant confirmation from the world around them. The moment a person becomes comfortable with silence, they begin noticing things that were previously hidden beneath noise, not because the world suddenly changes, but because attention changes. Most people move through conversations focused on what they are going to say next. They listen just enough to respond. They observe just enough to participate. Their minds are occupied with preparing, explaining, defending, or expressing. As a result, they miss countless details that reveal the true nature of the people around them. As Epictetus wisely noted, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak. Silence interrupts this pattern. It creates space. And in that space, observation becomes possible. People reveal far more than they intend to reveal. Not through grand confessions or dramatic moments, but through small, consistent behaviors. Through the way they respond to disappointment. Through the way they speak about others when those people are absent. Through the promises they make and the promises they keep. Through the emotions they display when circumstances stop favoring them. None of this requires interrogation. None of it requires manipulation. It simply requires patience. Given enough time, most individuals tell their story without realizing they are doing it. Their priorities become visible. Their character becomes visible. Their intentions become visible. The information is almost always there for those willing to pay attention. The difficulty is that many people are too eager to fill every moment with words. They reveal their plans before they have taken action. They announce goals before they have built discipline. They speak about ambitions while neglecting the work required to achieve them. There is a strange comfort in talking about progress because talking can create the illusion of movement. Yet words often provide satisfaction without accomplishment. The mind receives a temporary reward for sharing an intention, and that reward can reduce the urgency to act. What was supposed to become reality remains trapped in conversation. Something similar happens with frustration. A difficult experience occurs, and the immediate impulse is to express every emotion attached to it. Anger seeks an outlet. Disappointment seeks validation. Confusion seeks agreement. Yet not every feeling improves when it is immediately released. Some emotions become clearer when they are first examined in private. They settle. They reveal their source. What initially appeared to be anger may actually be insecurity. What appeared to be resentment may be disappointment. Reflection creates understanding. Reaction often bypasses it. The same principle applies to conflict. Many people feel compelled to engage in every disagreement they encounter. Every criticism demands a defense. Every insult demands a response. Every challenge demands participation. Yet not every battle improves life by being fought. As Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." Some arguments consume energy while producing nothing of value. Some conflicts continue only because both sides refuse to step away. There is strength in knowing when engagement serves a purpose and when it merely feeds distraction. Walking away from unnecessary conflict is not weakness. In many cases, it is evidence of control. But something changes when the exchange is refused. The expected reaction never arrives. The anger that was supposed to trigger anger encounters calm instead. The disrespect that was supposed to create conflict meets indifference. The attempt to disturb another person's peace fails because there is no cooperation. This does not mean becoming passive. It does not mean accepting poor treatment. It means recognizing that self-control is often more effective than emotional retaliation. The person who remains composed retains the ability to choose their next move with clarity. Over time, the benefits of this approach extend beyond difficult interactions. Observation becomes sharper, decisions become more deliberate. Relationships become easier to evaluate because actions are examined more closely than words. The need to constantly express, defend, and react begins to fade. In its place comes a quieter confidence rooted in awareness rather than performance. And from that awareness emerges an important realization. The greatest influence a person can possess is rarely found in controlling others. It is found in maintaining authority over themselves, especially when circumstances invite them to surrender it. The ability to govern yourself is one of the rarest qualities a person can develop. Many spend years trying to gain influence over circumstances, opportunities, and other people, believing that control over external conditions is the highest form of power. Yet external conditions are unstable by nature. People change, situations change, opportunities appear and disappear. Even the most carefully constructed plans can be interrupted by events beyond anyone's influence. This is why the Stoics placed such importance on self-mastery. They understood that a person who depends entirely on external outcomes will always live on uncertain ground. But a person who learns to govern their own thoughts, actions, and responses carries stability wherever they go. One of the most powerful fears is the fear of loss, the fear of losing connection, the fear of losing opportunities, the fear of losing security, the fear of losing approval. These fears influence countless decisions every day. They encourage people to cling tightly to things that may no longer serve them. They create the belief that holding on is always safer than letting go. Yet this belief often creates the very suffering it seeks to avoid. The tighter a person clings to something out of fear, the more control that thing begins to have over them. This is why freedom and attachment have a complicated relationship. Many people assume freedom comes from acquiring more resources, more relationships, more recognition, more influence. Yet genuine freedom often begins with the realization that peace cannot depend entirely on possession. A person becomes vulnerable when their well-being depends on keeping every external condition exactly as it is. Life does not work that way. Change is inevitable. Loss is inevitable. Uncertainty is inevitable. The person who accepts this reality becomes far more resilient than the person who spends their life resisting it. There is a noticeable difference between someone who chooses and someone who clings. The person who chooses acts from clarity. The person who clings acts from fear. On the surface, their behavior may appear similar. Both may remain committed to a relationship. Both may pursue opportunities. Both may invest deeply in important goals. The difference lies beneath the action itself. One acts because the choice aligns with their values. The other acts because the alternative feels unbearable. One moves towards something meaningful. The other runs from something frightening. This willingness creates a form of strength that cannot be manufactured through appearance alone. Many people attempt to project confidence while privately fearing every possible loss. Their confidence depends on circumstances remaining favorable. The moment circumstances change, their certainty disappears. Genuine confidence works differently. It emerges from the knowledge that discomfort can be endured, rejection can be survived, solitude can be tolerated, failure can be learned from. This knowledge reduces fear because it removes the illusion that every setback is catastrophic. As this understanding deepens, relationships begin to change. Decisions become clearer, standards become easier to maintain. There is less temptation to tolerate situations that undermine self-respect, not because a person becomes rigid or demanding, but because they recognize the cost of abandoning their own values. The need to please everyone begins to fade. The need to secure every opportunity begins to fade. What remains is a growing commitment to alignment between actions and principles. This commitment produces an unexpected sense of abundance, not abundance in the material sense, but abundance in perspective. Scarcity creates desperation because it convinces a person that every opportunity must be preserved at all costs. Abundance creates patience because it recognizes that no single outcome determines an entire life. A person operating from abundance does not rush decisions out of fear. They do not cling to situations simply because alternatives are unknown. They trust their ability to adapt, rebuild, and move forward if necessary. This realization changes priorities. The goal is no longer to be noticed by everyone. The goal becomes becoming someone whose presence matters when it is felt. There is a difference. One seeks visibility, the other seeks substance. Visibility can be created through constant exposure. Substance is built slowly through character, discipline, and consistency. One depends on being seen. The other exists whether anyone is watching or not. This distinction becomes increasingly important because modern life often encourages the opposite approach. It rewards noise. It rewards constant sharing. It rewards endless accessibility. Yet what is constantly displayed often loses its impact. What is carefully preserved tends to carry greater weight. The Stoics reflected often on mortality because it forced them to confront this reality directly. They did not dwell on death out of fear. They reflected on it because it clarified life. When a person remembers that time is finite, many unnecessary concerns begin to lose their power. Petty conflicts become less important. Endless comparisons become less important. The desire to satisfy every expectation becomes less important. The awareness of limitation creates focus. It reminds a person that every choice carries a cost because every choice consumes a portion of a resource that can never be replenished. This perspective changes the way commitments are viewed. Instead of asking whether something can be done, a person begins asking whether it deserves to be done. Instead of automatically accepting every invitation, request, or obligation, they become more selective. Not because they think they are superior to others, but because they recognize that saying yes to one thing always means saying no to something else. As Seneca warned, it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. A commitment accepted without thought may eventually take time away from a goal that genuinely matters. A distraction accepted casually may consume energy that was needed elsewhere. Small decisions accumulate. Over time, they shape entire lives. The people who carry themselves with the greatest sense of presence often understand this principle deeply. Their words carry weight because they do not speak carelessly. They listen before responding. They think before committing. They avoid making promises they cannot keep. When they offer their attention, it feels meaningful because it is not distributed automatically. There is a difference between attention that is given deliberately and attention that is given out of habit. One communicates respect, the other often communicates obligation. Something interesting happens when a person begins treating their own time with respect. Other people notice, not always consciously, but they notice. Boundaries become clearer, expectations become healthier, interactions become more intentional. The individual who respects their own attention teaches others how to respect it as well. This lesson is rarely communicated through words. It is communicated through behavior, through consistency, through the willingness to protect what matters without apology. People learn what is acceptable by observing what is tolerated. They learn what has value by observing how it is treated. Many spend years trying to earn respect directly. They argue for it. They demand it. They become frustrated when it is not given. Yet respect rarely emerges from demands. It emerges from conduct. It grows when actions align with principles. It grows when standards are maintained consistently. It grows when a person demonstrates that their values are not negotiable simply because external pressure appears. The individuals who command respect most naturally are often the least concerned with chasing it. Their attention remains focused on living according to what they believe rather than constantly seeking validation from others. This creates a subtle but important shift in identity. A person stops viewing accessibility as proof of goodness. They stop assuming that endless availability is a virtue in itself. Instead, they recognize that accessibility is a choice, a meaningful choice, one that should be guided by purpose rather than habit. Not everyone deserves unlimited access to your energy. Not every request deserves immediate attention. Not every opportunity deserves acceptance. Discernment becomes more important than availability. Intention becomes more important than reaction. As this understanding deepens, life begins to feel different. There is less urgency to prove worth, less pressure to remain constantly visible, less fear of missing out on experiences that do not align with personal priorities. A quiet confidence begins to emerge, not the confidence that comes from superiority, but the confidence that comes from clarity. The confidence of knowing what matters and what does not. The confidence of understanding that attention is finite and therefore valuable. The confidence of recognizing that presence becomes meaningful when it is offered consciously rather than automatically. This is where many people discover something they had been searching for all along. They discover that value does not come from being everywhere. It comes from being fully present where it truly matters. It does not come from endless availability. It comes from thoughtful investment. It does not come from collecting approval. It comes from living in alignment with principles that remain steady regardless of who is watching. And when a person reaches that point, their presence begins carrying a different quality. It becomes calmer, stronger, more deliberate. Not because they are trying to appear important, but because they finally understand that their life is too valuable to be spent carelessly, and their attention is too precious to be given away without purpose. At the end of the day, the goal was never to become unavailable. It was to become intentional, to stop giving away your time, attention, and peace without thought, to recognize that your life is finite, your energy is valuable, and your presence means something. The moment you truly understand that, everything changes. You stop chasing, you stop proving, you stop negotiating your worth. And in that quiet space, you begin to discover a freedom that no one can give you and no one can take away.